Mr. Cells, bridge inspectors certify completed structures. They don't run combat crossings. Captain Ross Oldgate said it in front of his company. 30 years old Ranger Tab, 2 live combat bridging operations in Helmand Province. The only battalion-level field crossing SOP in the 82nd Engineer Brigade, written from actual combat experience. 22 soldiers on the near bank of the Cape Fur River heard every word. They don't run combat crossing operations. If you have a safety concern, file it with my S3 after the exercise. Right now, I need this lane clear. 8 feet away, Dwey Crawford Cells was 79 years old and already holding a Lufkin folding rule. 6-foot chrome-plated zigzag style, closed, thumb resting on the first fold. He had not reached for it. After 60 years working anchor sites, the rule found his hand the way a level finds a carpenter's hand in the dark. Not searched for, arrived. He did not leave. He took 3 steps around the anchor state cluster, dopped, placed the closed rule flat against the shaft, and read the burial angle by eye along the rule's edge. 2 seconds, stood 4 measured steps back along the tension line toward the river, crouched, marked the clay with his boot heel, stood, pointed at the mark with the hook's closed rule. Your anchor needs to come out of the ground here, not there. 4 degrees. That's what's inverting your load. 40 seconds. He had not opened the rule. He had not touched the anchor. He had not pulled the olive drab manual from his vest pocket. 1953 US MCM 520. Spiral-bound electrical tape tabbing. Page 64. A margin note on page 68 in his own handwriting. 73 years old. Not in any digital archive. Not in the current Army FM. Oldgate looked at the bootil mark on the clay. He looked at his GNSS printout. $22,000 survey receiver logging every anchor position. The FM burial angle confirmed correct across 340 validated test crossings. The logged angle matched the table exactly. The bootil mark on the clay was 4 degrees off both of them. The medevac scenario clock on the range control board read 21 minutes. Type anchor in the comments if you're... We've watched someone solve in 40 seconds what a certified protocol missed in 3 hours. And stay with us, because what is written on page 68 of that 1953 manual was removed from the Army's field guidance in 1991. What happened to that clock, and why the footnote was removed, and what Dwey Crawford Cells was doing at this riverbank 3 years before today. All of it is coming. Dwey Crawford Cells had been waking at 5 o'clock since Korea, and the first thing he did every morning was listen, not to an alarm. He had not used an alarm in 40 years. He listened to the Lumber River. It ran 200 meters from his back porch in Lumberton, and he had lived beside it long enough to know the difference between how it sounds after a dry week and how it sounds after overnight rain, whether the variance is 1 feet of water table or 3. This morning it was running fast. He poured his coffee and stood on the porch in the November dark and listened and thought, the Cape Fear will sound the same way this morning. He thought about clay over sand substrate after rain. He thought about anchors. It was the specific vigilance of a man who knows exactly what a failed anchor sounds like at the moment before it fails, and who cannot unknow it, and who has therefore made it his business to be at every anchor before the load comes on. The inspection folder for today sat on the kitchen table beside the coffee maker. River Crossing Evaluation, 2nd Engineer Battalion, Cape Far Crossing Lane, Fort Bragg. He had been to this site 4 times in 11 years. On the 3rd visit 3 years ago, he had written a note in his inspection report about the clay of a sand substrate at the primary anchor position. A burial angle correction of 4 degrees, technical basis attached, source cited. The comment had been filed and not acted on. He went to the bedroom and picked up the 1953 manual from the nightstand where it lived, not the vest pocket. That was where it worked. The nightstand was where it rested. He opened to page 68 without looking. The way a man dials a number he has dialed 10,000 times. The electrical tape tab found his thumb. He read the margin note in his own handwriting. Ferris. Burial angle -4 degrees from printed table in clay, over sand substrate. Verified 3 crossings, and remembered, as he always did when he read it, who Ferris was and what Ferris had shown him at Incheon in 1950. Before either of them knew what the Imgen River was or what it was going to cost, he closed the manual, put it in his vest pocket. The Lufkin rule was on the nightstand beside it. Same position it had occupied every night since Norminen was alive. And she had never once asked why he kept a folding rule on the nightstand, which was one of the things about 41 years of marriage that he had understood clearly only after she was no longer there to not ask it. He put the rule in his hip pocket. It was 7 minutes 5. He drove north on US 74 in the dark. The coffee in the truck's cup holder going cold the way it always went cold on the highway because he never remembered to drink. Well, he was already at the site. He arrived 45 minutes before the exercise was scheduled to begin. He parked at the range control lot and walked the crossing lane alone down to the Cape Fear bank, the river running fast and cold, exactly as the Lumber River had told him it would. He crouched at the anchor stake cluster and pressed 2 fingers into the bank. Clay over sand wet to the second knuckle, the substrate giving the specific soft resistance of a bank that holds a stake cleanly, but releases it at angles the stake was not designed for. He read the burial angle by eye, made a note in his inspection book. Clay sat wet, angle low, same as the report file 2021. He already knew what the morning was going to find. He had known it 3 years ago. The exercise had been running for 2 hours and 40 minutes when Dwey arrived at the anchor, perimeter, and Captain Oldgate had done everything right. That was the specific difficulty of the morning. He had confirmed the crossing schedule with S3 the week prior. He had run the anchor placement twice with his GNSS receiver, logging every stake position to centimeter accuracy against FM 334, 343. He had verified the burial angle 3 ways. The logged coordinates, the table values, the visual sightline, they agreed. He had done this because 2 inversions in the same direction on the same anchor cluster is not bad luck. It is a mechanism, and Oldgate was the kind of officer who wanted to find mechanisms, not manage symptoms. He had found nothing. The mechanism was in a table he had no reason to doubt. Both inversions had failed the same way. Load came on at the second soldier's crossing weight. The walking cable sagged left. The line rotated below the handrail cables, and the crossing became unusable. 22 soldiers waiting on the near bank. The medevac scenario clock, a simulated casualty who needed to reach the far bank before the field hospital window closed, had been running since the exercise began. At 0940, it had read 40 minutes. At 11:27, when Dwey's truck came down the range control road, it read 23. Oldgate did not know that the Army Corps safety inspector, pulling on his orange vest in the parking lot, had flagged this specific anchor 3 years ago in a filed inspection report. He knew what he could see. A civilian contractor with a carabiner clipped hard hat approaching his anchor perimeter during an active live load evaluation in a lane that needed to be clear with 22 soldiers watching, and a clock that was no longer giving him room to be indirect. The dismissal was procedure. Dwey Crawford Cells had contract authority to halt the exercise on safety grounds, a fact printed on the work order that neither man mentioned aloud. Oldgate delivered it in front of his company because that was where he was standing. What happened after? The 3 steps, the closed rule flat against the shaft, the boot-ill mark in the clay. 40 seconds with nothing opened and nothing touched. He watched the way a man watches something he does not yet have a category for, without sacking, looking for the mechanism, because finding mechanisms was what he did. The boot-ill mark was 4 degrees off his FM table. His $22,000 GNSS receiver had nothing to say about 4 degrees of soil type error in clay over sand substrate because the table it confirmed had not been calibrated for clay over sand substrate, because the footnote that addressed that calibration had been removed from the FM in 1991 as geographically specific. Oldgate looked from the mark on the clay to the GNSS printout to the mark again. He looked at the 79-year-old man in the contractor vest who had just diagnosed his failed bridge, in the time it takes to read a grid coordinate. Then he said 2 words, "Show me." The 1953 manual came out of Dwey's vest pocket before Oldgate finished the second word. Not opened, produced. Dwey held it cover up and looked at Oldgate directly, for the first time since the dismissal. This is the EM 520 Field Bridging Supplement 1953. Pages 64 through 71 are the dead Mananka geometry section. He opened it to page 68 and held it out. Read the margin. 3rd paragraph. Oldgate read, the pencil note was faded, but fully legible. Ferris burial angle -4 degrees from printed table in clay, over sand substrate. Verified 3 crossings below it. Same hand, Imjin River, 1951. He looked up. This is a 73-year-old pencil note. That is correct, Dwey said. The soil type calibration footnote for clay over sand was in the printed FM table until 1991, when it was removed as geographically specific. Your table is right for what it was tested in. It is not right for this bank. He took the manual back, closed it, returned it to his vest pocket. You've got 19 minutes. Do you want to discuss the footnote, or do you want to fix the anchor? Oldgate looked at him for one full second. Then he turned to his senior NCO. "Get me 3 people on the primary cluster." Now the re-rig moved on Dwey's voice. He did not touch the stakes himself. These were 3-foot steel anchor pins driven into riverbank clay, and that was work for the soldiers already positioning in front of him, who had been watching him for 40 seconds, and had moved before Oldgate confirmed the order. Dwey stood at the bank edge with the Lufkin rule open in his right hand, to assume determined, extended the chrome-plated sections catching the grain of emberite, and called every one measurement from where he stood, the way a calibrated instrument reads, number first, explanation. After pull the primary cluster, clean vertical pull. No torque on the shaft. A pause while they worked. Good. Red drive at the heel mark. Drive angle perpendicular to the bank surface, not to the water line, to the surface as it sits. Clay slopes 3 degrees east here, so your perpendicular is 3 degrees east of plumb. One soldier started to compensate by eye. Dewey, hold your sight line. Trust the angle, not your eye. Your eye is reading the water. The soldier held. The stake went in clean. Set your binder at 42 inch above the pinhead. Not 40, not 45, 42. Oldgate had been watching Dwey's hands rather than the work. The Lufkin rule was the only instrument in use. No GPS, no table lookup, no reference back to the manual. The measurements arrive the way coordinates arrive, from a system that has been running long, enough to produce them without prompt. That's your angle, Dwey said, when the redriven cluster was set. He extended the open rule against the new stake shaft, read the position, nodded once. That's Ferris's number. Questions were for after Oldgate ordered the first crossing attempt. The load came on at the first soldier's weight, and the walking cable held level. Level at the second, level at the third. Quieter than confirmation, but more durable. The medevac scenario casualty crossed at 7 minutes remaining on the clock. 22 soldiers on the near bank did not cheer. They were soldiers, not a stadium. But the sergeant at the anchor cluster exhaled through his nose and turned away from the river, and a specialist at the midline let both hands drop off the safety rail at the same moment, and these were the same thing rendered in 2 bodies. Oldgate stood at the bank edge and watched the far shore. His face held the specific stillness of a man who has seen something work and needs now to understand it, not operationally, which he had already received, but in the longer sense. What it means for the system he trusted, and for the footnote that system removed, and for the table he will write his next SOP from. He heard boots on the clay path behind him. Frank Dugan came up from the range control building at the clearing edge. 62 years old, Fort Bragg civilian technical advisor, retired warrant officer, 26 years Army engineer, carrying a printout from the Army Corps Inspector database. He stopped beside Dwey. He did not hand the printout to anyone yet. He watched the rope bridge holding level over the Cape Fear River and said 4 words to no one in a particular. He walked the Minjan. Oldgate heard it. He looked at Dugan. He looked at the man in the orange vest with the Lufkin rule in his hand and the 1953 manual in his pocket. He had a clock that had just cleared, a 4 degrees recorrection holding a bridge his FM table said should already be holding, and 4 words he did not yet have a frame for. He could feel that the frame was close. He could feel it was going to require more than a minute to build. The small space filled with recirculated air and the smell of wet-out ear and river clay drying on boot soles. It sounded like weather, not consequence. Dugan set the printout on the folding table beside the open 1953 manual. He did not speak. He sat down across from the empty chair and looked at his own hands. Oldgate read the printout standing. Standard Army Corps Inspector formatting. Contract number Inspection District active status. He found what he was looking for in the lower third. Relevant prior service, USMC 1st Marine Division Combat Engineer, Incheon, landing September 1950. Chosen reservoir withdrawal November to December 1950. Imjin River crossing operations, April to June 1951. Separated Staff Sergeant June 1957. He read the next line. Published technical contributions. Imjin River Crossing Anchor Geometry Field Report, 1952, cited in USMC, Combat Engineer Field, Manual EM 520, 1953 Supplement, as primary data source for Deadman Anchor Geometry section, pages 64 to 71. He read that line twice. Then he looked at the manual, open on the table. Electrical tape tab on page 64, margin note on page 68, in the handwriting he had now been looking at for 40 minutes. He looked at Dwey, who was standing at the room's single utility sink, drying his hands on a gray shop rag with the unhurried attention of a man who has finished a piece of work and is preparing to be somewhere else. The footnote on page 68, Oldgate said, the Ferris calibration, it's cited as the data source for pages 64 to 71. He paused. You wrote pages 64 to 71. Dewey folded the shop rag and set it on the edge of the sink. Ferris found it. I had the pencil. Oldgate waited. Dewey looked at him, reading what kind of waiting it was, then pulled out the plastic chair across from Dugan and sat down. He told it the way he had debriefed things for 70 years, in sequence with the relevant variables, if without ornament. The crossing operation, April 1951. The Imgen River clay over sandbanks, similar to the Cape Fear and substrate. The burial angle protocol they were running correct, for the soil it had been designed for. Wrong, for the soil they were in. The first crossing which held the second, which held the third which failed. The rope going slack before the snap. He had felt it on the far bank. He had known in that half-second exactly what the slack meant. His name was Corporal Ellis Puit. Dewey said he was on the near bank when the anchor walked out. The bridge inverted. He went into the river. He stopped not for effect. The way you stop when the sequence arrives at a fact that requires no elaboration. The anchor was 4 degrees shallow. That is the error. That is what the Ferris calibration corrects. He looked at the printout on the table without touching it. Master Sergeant Ferris had been trying to confirm the number across 2 previous river crossings. The Imgen gave us the sample size, 3 crossings, his calibration, my report, the supplement, that is the chain. The prefab was quiet enough to hear the Cape Far through the single window. Oldgate said the soil type footnote was removed from the FM in 1991. If it had stayed in, Dwey said, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But it didn't stay in. So here we are. He said it without bitterness and without resignation. The way a man states a hydraulic fact, the river runs the direction it runs. The footnote was removed. The only variable remaining is what happens next. Oldgate did not try to resolve the system's failure by explaining it or defending the river, Wevision scission cycle, or identifying whose desk the comment should have stopped on. He sat with it for 3 full seconds, which is longer than it sounds, in a quiet prefab, with 3 men and a printout on a folding table. The same quality that had sent him walking a tension line twice, looking for a mechanism, was the quality that received this. When the evidence arrived, he did not deflect. Dugan had been looking at his hands the whole time. He spoke without raising his head. I certified the battalion SOP 14 months ago, he said. The soil type calibration gap was in my review notes. I passed it with a flag that wasn't acted on. He looked up at the manual, not at Oldgate. I've been reading Dwey's name on Fort Bragg crossing site inspection reports for 11 years. He's on every active crossing in the Army Corps database. He set his palm flat on the printout. I didn't know the manual was his until today. The 3 men sat with this. The rope bridge held level over it. The corrected anchor set in the clay at Ferris's number, 4 degrees from where it had been placed this morning, 73 years after the measurement was confirmed at a river in Korea by 2 men, one of whom had a pencil. The Cape Fear was still audible from where they stood, moving fast, the sound carrying flat, across the clearing, the way water carries when there was no wind to compete with it. Oldgate came out 20 minutes after Dwey had loaded his vest into the passenger seat. He was carrying a copy of the memorandum he had submitted through the battalion S3 FM3-34. 343 revision request. He said reinstatement of the clay, of Sandown substrate calibration in the Deadman anchor. Geometry section, supporting data attached to today's crossing evaluation. The Cape Fear Bank. Soil profile citation of the 1952 Immune River Field Report. He held the copy out. Your name is on it as the originating source. Dwey took the paper, read the relevant paragraph once, folded it, put it in his shirt pocket behind the inspection notebook. How long does a memo like that take? 6 to 18 months, depending on the revision cycle. Dwey nodded. I'll be around. He said it as a statement of fact. He had been around for 11 years. The river was not going anywhere. Oldgate stood with his hands at his sides, the specific posture of a man who has one more thing, and is deciding how to say it. He said 3 years ago, you flagged the anchor angle in your inspection report. It wasn't acted on. You came back 4 times anyway. Why? Dwey looked at the tree line at the clearing edge where the river sounded closest. He said, because the river is still there. The clay is still clay, and someone was going to load that bridge again. Oldgate did not try to improve on this. He offered his hand. Dwey shook it. The brief, firm contact of a man who has shaken 10,000 hands and given each one the same exact pressure. The handshake that says, I received you, and I'm done. He got in his truck. He drove south on US 74.